Without any further ado, Excellency, distinguished panel, OIT and Way Forward colleagues and participants joining us today, thank you for making the time to discuss building resilience to bridge trade gaps through digital transformation, which is being co-hosted by the Organization of Women in International Trade, OIT, that's the UK chapter, and the global NGO Women's Economic Imperative, WAY. My name is Noreen Cesario and I am the president of OIT UK. I am a champion for global economic empowerment and a trade lead with WAY. I sit on the board of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group for Women and Enterprise, co-chairing the International Trade and Connection subgroup. I am also an entrepreneur running a UK-based international strategic advisory firm covering digital trade, marketing and communications. And as a gender champion, I have led research and published reports as well as participated in international meetings like this to further this agenda. During our working session today, we shall look at ways in which government and private enterprise can collaborate to ensure the broadest range of opportunities remain open to all women to acquire digital skills, build resilience, and ensure sustainable growth in international trade following the disruptions and further inequalities in supply chains caused by the pandemic. Outcomes from today will suggest possible collaborative areas such as digital transformation and practical solutions, which can then be implemented and shared as best practice globally. It is my pleasure to welcome as panel speakers, His Excellency Dr. Didacus Jules, Director General Commission of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, Susan Barton, Team Leader, Trade and Gender Equality, Trade Policy Department for International Trade for the UK, Chris Southwood, Secretary General, International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC of the United Kingdom, and Dr. Amrita Bahri, Associate Professor of International Trade Law at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM, Co-Chair Professor for WTO Chair Program in Geneva. My colleague, Dr. Roslyn Wanjiru, Women's Economic Imperative Global Lead on Trade and Investment Policy, will be providing a recap following our Q&A. Today's session would have not been possible without my fellow trade lead, Nicole Peter-Patterson, OIT VP International Affairs and WAY Trade Lead. Nicole is a Senior International Development Advisor with 20 plus years of expertise. She has focused her career in international development for micro-businesses, women's economic empowerment, and tech for good advocacy. We invited our esteemed panel to contribute as a result of the work they're all involved in. During the WTO Public Forum 2019, when we looked at gender inclusiveness in trade and services, OIT and WAY also co-hosted a working session, looking at how we could create an ecosystem conducive for women-owned businesses to grow and mature. We discussed how advances in technology have revolutionized existing sectors and created new service sectors, and how technology has led to new business models that represent game changers for women in a range of industries. In our outcomes, we recommended setting up a working group to look at country-level programs that can be piloted and then shared as best practice. We are delighted that following our initial lead, this has now materialized as an official working group and also Agenda Hub. OIT and WAY are both spearheading activity to raise awareness, open markets, and educate women business owners. Together with governments, organizations, and private sector, we must develop frameworks that deliver the ecosystem that can be used as best practice globally. So it is with pleasure that we're able to continue this discussion today to see how we can grow and invest in these ecosystems at the country level, which work for gender inclusion and with the Gender Hub, and how we can best harness digital transformation to enable us to do that. Within that background, I now invite our first speaker, His Excellency Dr. Didacus Jules, Director General, Commission of the OECS in Santa Lucia. He will be speaking as our first speaker. Dr. Jules has extensive region and international experience focused on education, social policy, and organizational transformation. In May 2014, he took up the role as the Director General of the OECS and has occupied senior leadership roles within the region. He's also a published author on educational policy, educational reform, adult educational, public sector reform, organizational transformation, and cultural studies. Dr. Didacus, my first question to you is, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank was awarded the 2021 FinTech and RegTech Global Award for the successful pioneered and innovative Dcash digital currency. The introduction of this digital sovereign currency, providing a more resilient payment system in the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, the ECCU, has been a critical response to the pandemic, where customers were unable to complete financial transactions due to economic lockdowns. What are the implications for trade finance across the OECS and its trade partners to achieve deeper financial inclusion, economic growth, resilience, and competitiveness? Over to you. You will need to unmute your mic, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Noreen. Let me first of all, in referencing the Dcash initiative of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, commend our Governor of the Central Bank, Timothy Antoine, and his team for the launching what is the first digital currency officially issued by a central bank anywhere in the world. The timeliness and significance of this must be contextualized in the historical moment in which we find ourselves. Our world today, by our lives and our livelihoods, have been brought to a virtual standstill by concurrent crises, COVID-19, climate change-induced disasters, and in the case of the OECS, volcanic eruptions in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. What I would like to do is to quickly identify some practical real-life situations in which Dcash can make a tangible difference to the lives of our people and the competitiveness and vibrancy of our economies. The first of these is in the arena of financial inclusion. The digital currency facilitates the ease and speed of financial transactions, and they do not necessarily require financial intermediaries with either high or multiple transaction costs across the transactional chain. So there's the immediacy of the transaction. There's also the virtual or the non-physical character of the transaction. So breaking that down to the life of an ordinary citizen, a farmer, a fisher, a retiree, a person with disability, a small business person, a single mother, a woman who is all of the above, all of them can transact their financial business in real time. They can receive cash digitally. They can issue payments for goods and services directly from their mobile phones without having to go physically to a bank or financial institution in order to conduct their financial business. Given the frequency also of the pandemic business lockdowns that have been required to contain the infection spread, and the very long lines that we see happening at banks when they open, or at financial intermediaries like Western Union, for example, the digital currency is convenient, cheaper, and faster to transact. Then the second area is a question of economic growth, resilience, and competitiveness. Dr. Barry, in one of her submissions, had indicated that more than 30% of the micro, small, and medium enterprises are owned by women. And e-commerce, therefore, provides a global platform and a potentially more level playing field for their conduct of business. In the case of the OECS, I would venture we are doing the studies right now, but it is certainly much higher than 30% of the MSMEs being led by women, and invariably single mothers, women who are sole proprietors. In the agricultural sector, for example, they play a very critical role. So that Dcash solution actually is a godsend at this point in time.
Thank you. As you said, this is indeed a game changer. Very, very interesting. I'm going to pass over next to our next speaker, who is Susan Barton, Team Leader, Trade and Gender Equality, Trade Policy Department for International Trade within the UK. Susan works for the UK Government Department on trade policy, strategy and negotiations. She currently works to advance gender equality and women's economic empowerment through the UK's independent trade policy. Widely recognised as an expert, she leads the team delivering chapters on gender equality in UK bilateral trade agreements, supporting the Friends of Gender group at the WTO, and securing agreement from the G7 trade ministers on women's economic empowerment in the inaugural G7 trade track. Susan, my question to you is, the G7 trade ministers under the UK presidency recognised the importance of digital trade to growth, innovation, productivity and prosperity. They recalled the immense opportunities that it offers to our people and our businesses, and they underlined the central role that it can play in the economic recovery from the pandemic. There is also evidence that the internet is an increasingly important facilitator of trade, and that digital trade can be a driver of inclusion, efficiency, and innovation. There is also evidence that e-commerce can deliver benefits for global gender equality. What are key interventions in terms of technology and digital solutions that the UK is delivering for women?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me today. I'm very honoured to be on a panel with such esteemed colleagues and experts. I think it's clear that digital technology is transforming the way people gain access to information and to markets. Throughout the public forum, speakers have highlighted how e-commerce has the potential to drive economic growth, reducing barriers to trade and opening opportunities in new markets. However, there are challenges. Yesterday at the Future is Digital session, we heard that whilst over 2/3 of businesses cite concerns about digital transformation to their operations, only 52% of businesses feel equipped to deal with these issues. This figure came from a survey of over 400 UK and international trade leaders conducted by Ernst & Young. If this is a challenge in the global north, how much more of a challenge is it in the global south? There is still a large digital gender divide in access and use of technology, which can intensify existing inequalities. Women and girls risk being left even further behind because they don't have the same access and skills as boys and men to technology. With this in mind, the UK government, through our Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, is committed to increasing access and improving skills at every stage of the digital journey, and takes a holistic approach to improving inclusion for women and girls through technology and digital interventions, including in LDCs. One key intervention is digital connectivity. In many developing countries, as we know, mobile phones serve as the primary medium for going online, yet women in low and middle income countries are on average 8% less likely to own a mobile phone than men. We are working with partners such as the GSMA and others to design and deliver programming to catalyse and facilitate affordable, inclusive and safe basic connectivity for excluded or underserved communities, including women. Beyond access and connectivity, the UK is also focused on improving digital skills and literacy, especially in trade. COVID-19 has highlighted the transformative way we can use technology to do business. However, to be successful in doing business online requires skills and support. Digital marketing, sales, communication, and social media presence are all absolutely critical to success. Women who are digitally excluded may not only lose out on new expansion opportunities, but might also lose their existing business if they don't have the skills to compete as others move online. The UK She Trades Commonwealth programme, run in partnership with the International Trade Centre, quickly identified the need and the demand for digital literacy and e-commerce skills within the first few months of the pandemic, pivoting training and coaching for the 3,300 women-owned businesses it works with to build their skills and confidence to run their businesses online. The UK also has a number of domestic initiatives that support women-led and owned businesses in the UK. For instance, our Global Entrepreneur Programme, which has a female founder group and does a lot of work around the Sustainable Development Goal 5, which, as we know, is on gender equality. They are currently running a competition to support female founder businesses. In summary, We have a wide range of development assistance programs funded by donor agencies and domestic governments to support women-owned businesses to be more digitally connected. But these are just touching the surface given the demand and the scale. I think we all understand the opportunity. Technology can help to circumvent the discriminatory behaviours experienced by women during face-to-face interaction. Women are more likely to use digital financial solutions to try to access trade finance, as they are more likely to get rejected from financial institutions. E-commerce platforms can bring women producers and traders closer to markets. Being more digitally connected allows women-owned businesses to gain market information in a more timely and cost-effective way. Digital methods give women access to international opportunities despite time and mobility constraints due to higher family obligations. Digitalisation is no longer a nice to have. It is a necessity to succeed in international trade.
Thank you, Susan. And that was a great intro to move to our next speaker, Chris. Chris Southwood, Secretary General, International Chamber of Commerce, ICC UK. Chris is also the director of the UK APPG for Trade and Export Promotion. Chris has occupied senior roles at trade and commerce organisations. He has also been a senior policy advisor at Parliament and has helped set up the mid-sized business export programme at UKTI. He is currently leading the discussion on the ICC digital trade roadmap for the UK. Chris, my question to you is this. The ICC Digital Trade Roadmap lays out the ICC commitment to build consensus, align resources, and connect initiatives to optimize digital trade efficiencies worldwide. However, ICC findings also indicate that despite more than 2 decades of trade digitization efforts, data issued last year showed that only 1% of bills of lading are issued electronically, even as around 50% of the world's traded services are in digital form. How will the ICC ensure that the proposed initiatives respond to the constraints of many countries? And in particular, how will this address the needs of women-owned businesses?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be speaking today. I think, let's make a point to begin with. If we really want to take seriously women in trade, then the question is, how do we enable that to happen? And to pick up on a point that was made earlier on, I think this is absolutely about creating a modern digital trade ecosystem that removes barriers, complexity, costs. Because what we do know is that 5 of 6 digital businesses worldwide are run by women. And so if we increase the access to the digital trade market, then we therefore increase access to opportunities for women in trade. So I think for me, the answer to the question, how do we get women into trade? Digital is a key enabler to making that happen. So let me just explain the context here. We're focusing at the moment very much on very specific documents that are used in the trade transaction process. Those are called documents of title or transferable records. And those are bills of lading, bills of exchange, promissory notes, documents that relate to the transfer of possession. So over the last number of years, we've made an enormous amount of progress on digitizing customs and trade facilitation documents through the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. But what that didn't pick up was digitizing these documents of title. So what we've got at the moment is a world where a lot of progress has been made on the customs side, but almost no progress has been made on the commercial document side. But the catch is, if we don't digitize all the documents, then the whole system reverts to paper. And let me just give you some of the numbers that we're talking about here. In a typical trade transaction, someone could be dealing with up to 28 documents, up to 35 government agencies. 8 of those documents relate to the documents of title, transferable records. That process can take up to 2 to 3 months, cost £80,000. Overall, there are 4 billion paper-based documents floating around the trade system at any given time. It's huge. So we can sweep away all that inefficiency, that carbon footprint, by simply focusing in on this particular area, digitizing documents of title, so that we bring that piece of the system in line with all the rest of the progress being made on customs. And we shouldn't be under any illusion that if we carry on as we are, that we are going to be able to transform that digital trade ecosystem. There are 3 building blocks to the system, 2 building blocks to the system, sorry. One is reforming our legal systems, updating them to accommodate the digitization of documents of title so we can handle those documents in digital form. And then secondly, to align our legal frameworks to the UNCITRAL Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records, MLETR as it's called. And then secondly, to then establish digital standards so that information can flow in the same format across systems, processes, private sector, public sector, and governments. If we do those things, then we can really operate at scale in a way that allows everybody to access a system at low cost and low complexity. So that's the real focus of ICC right now. And if you look at the economic business case for this, it is huge. The UK business case was published earlier in the year. And what we found that if we do this exercise, it's worth £225 billion in efficiency savings, £25 billion in fresh SME growth, £1 billion in extra trade finance. That's half the trade finance gap in the UK, by the way. And it will cut 35% of inefficiency out of SME business operations. So it's huge. And my message is very simple. Any government looking for a low cost, high return activity to drive economic growth, bring more women into the system, promote financial inclusion, tackle the trade finance gap. This is the single biggest initiative and program in world trade today.
Thank you, Chris. And on that note, I'm going to move on to our next panel speaker, Dr. Amrita Bahari, Associate Professor of International Trade Law at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de Mexico, the ITAM, Co-Chair Professor for WTO Chair Program Geneva, who has also just this morning launched a book here at the WTO Public Forum, Rethink, Repackage and Rescuing World Trade Law in the Post-Pandemic Era. Dr. Bahari is the founding chair of International Trade and Investment Law Research Group and founding member of the South Asian International Economic Law Network. She has published in international trade law, WTO dispute settlement, regional trade, gender justice, and so forth. She has authored the Public-Private Partnership for WTO Dispute Settlement, enabling developing countries. Her academic articles are published in prestigious journals, including the World Trade Review. Working with ITC's team, Amrita has designed the first framework to measure the gender responsiveness of free trade agreements. Amrita, my first question to you is, we applaud your work as part of the WTO Chairs Program publication on adapting to the digital trade era, challenges and opportunities, looking at how the rapid adoption of digital technologies can help developing countries increase their participation in world trade. In particular, can you advise how the use of digital innovations such as blockchain can empower women in trade?
Thank you for your question, Noreen. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel, indeed a great honor. To respond to your question, let me try to identify three potential benefits. There are plenty, but for the restriction of time, I think I can probably try and talk about three different benefits here. So the first obvious benefit that I think we've all talked about, Suzanne, Chris, is the access to finance. The second benefit is gaining official identification documents. And the third big benefit is market access and reduction of trade cost. So let me talk about the first benefit, market access to finance. We all understand that approximately 50% of women in the world do not have access to simple bank accounts or even basic financial services. In the rural areas of developing countries, the figure is 20%, because only about 20% of bank holders are women. Women without bank accounts have no credit history and hence a very limited access to credit options. This barrier is definitely being worsened by the ongoing pandemic. So in a world where majority of women still cannot have access to a simple bank account, blockchain can allow unbanked women to carry out payment transactions on a peer-to-peer basis without the need for a third-party intermediary to really intervene in there. It can allow women to have access to finance, receive, save, send money, and build creditworthiness to secure credit to grow or revive their businesses. And SMEs, 30% of which 110 SMEs are owned by women, they usually are not able to signal their financial fitness to the clients. And that's where they lose a huge chunk of market opportunities or government procurement opportunities, so to say. So blockchain has the ability to provide this financial lifeline, this financial identity to such companies. Coming to my second benefit. Now, according to the World Bank, women in developing countries are less likely than men to hold an official identification document. We're talking about simple documents, birth certificate, passport, or a national identity card, right? In certain countries, as we speak, married women cannot even apply for a national identity card in the same way as a married man. In fact, I never realized that I did not have a birth certificate myself up until 2010, when my first employer asked me for one to start the hiring process. And I called up my mom and I was like, I need my birth certificate. Could you please email it to me? She's like, you don't have one. So, and this is a common practice in developing countries. When a girl child is born, a birth certificate is not issued. So blockchain can allow these people to create their own digital identity. The question of identity is so important because it determines our ability to work, do business, travel, enter into contracts, register businesses. And that brings me to my third benefit. It can help reduce trade cost. Trade involves a lot of paperwork, as Chris was mentioning, and the cost is huge. There are problems associated with that paperwork. We know that trade via paper documents is not pandemic friendly. And during this pandemic, we have seen that there were problems in processing transactions that required paper documents, the problems in printing or scanning the documents when the people were at their homes, then shipping these documents to empty offices, trying to ship them through FedEx and alike when the courier services were completely disrupted. So trade did not stop during the pandemic, but the ability to trade was definitely paused. So blockchain-based applications, in my opinion, can help these MSMEs strengthen their ability to trade and be more resilient to such pandemic-like situations. And this is where probably I'll stop and wait for the questions.
Thank you, Amrita. It's quite interesting hearing you say that. I never realized the situation was like that. I'm going to now turn back for another round of questions with our speakers before we open up to a Q&A. And I will ask Dr. Jules to answer this next one. Today, e-commerce accounts for around 1/6 of all goods traded across borders, even as requisite legal and regulatory frameworks evolve. What are some of the OECS's initiatives underway to ensure digital trade and e-commerce readiness? And what are some critical components to facilitate increased and coordinated multilateral response to bridge existing and emerging digital divides to allow more countries to achieve the benefits of inclusive digitalization?
Yeah, well, I was first of all fascinated by the comments made by Chris, where he spoke empirically to the need for a digital ecosystem. I'm happy to say that at the OECS level, we have a vision for digital transformation. And what we've done is to use a project with the World Bank on digital transformation as the nucleus of that broader transformation effort. So we're not treating these things as separate projects. And I think that's one of the big weaknesses in many developing countries, where we look at digital transformation in silos. We need to see it in an ecosystemic perspective. The World Bank project, as I said, is serving as the nucleus for that. And there are three major components: creating a digital enabling environment, developing and putting in place digital infrastructure, platforms, and services. And thirdly, digital skills and technology adoption. And in each of these, we have a number of very specific initiatives. So increased access, the digital enabling environment, for example, speaks to changes that we need to make in the telecom sector for liberalization, creating a more enabling environment, digital financial services, an enabling environment and the institutional structures around that, and cybersecurity, data protection, privacy enabling environment and the institutional structures. Now, associated with that environment, this is funded by the World Bank, but we've added other partnerships and projects to this. So for example, in the digital enabling environment, we speak into strengthening entrepreneurship and innovation ecosystems. And we're working with the IDB and Compete Caribbean on that. We're also looking at the OECS Going Digital methodology and standards. And there we're doing some work with Indigenous Caribbean expertise on that. The creation of a data council for the OECS and a different project with the World Bank on statistics. We're looking at how we can make that happen. When we speak to digital government infrastructure, we're talking about cross-cutting digital services enablers. So digital ID, which Dr. Barry just spoke about, blockchain is definitely on our agenda. What she was speaking to really addresses the issue of the single sovereign identity question. So we are looking at, especially in the context of our regional integration effort, using blockchain for that single sovereign ID that will be worked across the regional platform. Cloud infrastructures, registries, information systems, capacity building of government IT departments, government productivity platforms, and citizen-centric digital services. That's with the World Bank. With UNICEF, we are looking at a giga project that has to do with the provision of broadband services for schools and connectivity in the OECS. Now, interestingly, since COVID, we have repurposed that conception because we recognize that it's no longer about broadband for learning at schools, but equally important, broadband for learning at home. And again, this is where all kinds of gender complexities come into this, because again, what do you do with single mothers who have 2 or 3 kids who are now latchkey kids at home? The mothers have to go to work, the kids have to learn from home. What do we do about that? The creation of an OECS learning hub, and we're working with a number of institutions around that, and e-learning, COVID initiatives, a digital ecosystem. And lastly, on the digital skills and technology adoption front, the World Bank project provides for digital skills development. And but we are looking at other initiatives that have to do with how do we ensure worker recertification, retraining, training for youth, women, the differently abled, technology skills training, and also the opportunities in there for them to, through the skills and the accreditation that they get, to participate in the digital economy. Again, if you think through this, there are huge gender benefits to be derived from that. Both, not just gender in the sense of empowerment of women, but also in the context of the Caribbean, what do we do about the boys at risk, males at risk in the region, and how they become more productively engaged in digital economies? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jules. That was most informative and eye-opening as well. If I may pass over to Susan, it's really interesting to hear how the UK government is supporting the digital inclusion agenda through development assistance. But what about the use of trade policy as a tool to scale up? The ICC indicates that despite more than 2 decades of trade digitization efforts, data issued last year showed that only the 1%, as Chris mentioned earlier, were being issued electronically. McKinsey Global Institute estimates that around 50% of the world's traded services are in digital form, while e-commerce accounts for around 1/6 of all goods traded across borders. What policies can government put in place to actively support women to scale up?
Thank you. A really interesting question, and it picks up on what previous speakers have said, and that we need to transform the digital ecosystem. And Chris gave us an example of a very specific, low-cost, high-impact intervention that can be transformative. I want to make three more general points when we think about the impacts of trade policies on women. The first point I want to make is that trade is not gender neutral, and that is because the structure of our economies is not gender neutral. So this differential impact exists, even though the wording of legal texts governing trade is gender neutral. So the impact of trade rules on men and women differ according to the socially determined roles of the different genders in our respective countries, and we know that those impacts are different depending on the country context. And we therefore have to apply a gender lens to all our trade policies and consider how they impact differently on men and women because of the different roles they play in society. I think it's also important that we recognise the multiple roles that women play as entrepreneurs, as employees, as consumers, as carers, as citizens. And we must also recognise the importance of embedding women's experiences throughout our trade policy development. And we need to encourage more women to participate in conversations around trade. I also want to clarify that whilst women's economic empowerment supports economic growth, the converse is not true. So economic growth does not automatically lead to women's economic empowerment. And that's why this conversation is so important. The second point I want to make is around the UK's G7 presidency. We're trying to forward this agenda with some of the richest nations in the world who have resources to more actively address this agenda. And we have strived to encourage progress on both digital trade and women's economic empowerment in the G7 this year. We have had focused discussions with other G7 trade ministers around building the evidence base on the barriers faced by women in trade and collectively agreeing shared priorities. Digital trade was a priority area, amplifying the digital and technology imperative to build back better to ensure that global digital markets are open for entrepreneurism and innovation to thrive. The leaders of the G7 at Carbis Bay invited trade ministers to support the wider WTO membership to deliver an ambitious outcome at MC12 to bolster women's participation in trade and economic empowerment. Finally, I want to make the point that the digital economy is an important driver of wider economic growth and has a critical role to play in promoting development and inclusion. As you know, the UK is a strong supporter of modern and ambitious digital provisions in trade agreements. This includes ambitious and liberal provisions that support international cross-border data flows, ensuring personal protections are not put at risk. We're looking to complement our work in international fora with a dialogue on development cooperation in bilateral FTA negotiations. The UK wants to encourage cooperation in the delivery of shared development objectives, such as the greater integration of developing countries into the international trading system and supporting the adoption of global rules and norms for digital trade. So in summary, I've tried to make 3 points. The first, that trade is not gender neutral because the structure of the economy is not gender neutral. The second, we have to use all mechanisms, including bilateral and multilateral fora, to find ways forward. And I touched on the significance of the forthcoming MC12, which maybe we'll have time to follow up in the conversation later on. The final point I made was that the digital economy cannot be overlooked if we want trade to support inclusion, including gender equality and development.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to pass back to Chris, and this is a follow-on on what you were talking before when you were talking about the alignment, the requirements for the alignment to the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law and the Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records. We know that widespread adoption and implementation are still yet to be achieved. As you noted yourself in your call for the UK to be the first country in the G7 to fully digitize its trading system in line with digitization initiatives in Asia. Given the urgency of economic digitalization today, what 3 main things to drive digital trade and associated secure trade finances can you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some great points being picked up here by Dukas and Susan. I think, this idea of digital trade ecosystems is really fundamental. You know, there's got to be a strategy that kind of picks up on the different aspects. For the purpose of what I'm discussing here, I'm really focusing in on that trade transaction space, because that's really what's holding back the whole system, and which is why we're trying to unblock it so the whole system can leap forward. And then I totally agree with the point Susan's just made. You know, we've really got to focus on this digital trade economy. That's the future. It's about getting the building blocks in right now and moving it forward. I mean, the 2017 ICC Digital Trade Roadmap really set out 3 pillars of work, and those 3 pillars of work remain the same now as they were then, except we've come a long way during that period of time. But the first pillar of work is really aimed for governments. You know, what do governments need to do? And I've already described, you know, we need laws updated. Some of those laws, by the way, go back an awful long time. In the case of the UK, it was 1882, the Bills of Exchange Act. It's centuries old, not years old. So, you know, we need some tweaking to our existing laws, some alignment to this MLETR framework at UNCITRAL. That gives us a scalable environment. That's really, really fundamental. The second pillar of work is led by the ICC Digital Standards Initiative in Singapore. That's backed by the Asia Development Bank and Enterprise Singapore and the ICC. And their job is to start establishing common interoperable digital standards. They already have 3 listed on their website, and they're busy working through the trade ecosystem now, vetting and sort of classing what is existing in the system and promoting the use of those and what doesn't exist. And let's create the standards where they need to exist, i.e. joining up tech platforms, joining up blockchain systems and processes. That all needs to be done. So that's the ICC Digital Standards Initiative. And then the third pillar of work is really over to industry, to support industry to start to make the internal business cases to update their own internal systems so that these documents and this information can move around the corporate industry environment, just like it will be able to move around the government environment, and then the two can connect in an interoperable fashion. So those are the 3 pillars of work. There's some great progress being made. Singapore, Abu Dhabi, and Bahrain have already reformed and aligned legal infrastructure. We've got Kiribati and Belize coming this year or early next year. They're in Parliament already with updated laws on the table. That's fantastic news, particularly good for the developing countries. And then we've got the UK as the first big G7 economy. Is going to come, a new law is going to come into force midway 2022, and then we can digitize the whole system in the UK. Then we've got business cases coming in on France and Germany in terms of 2 big economies, and the Netherlands in Europe in the next few months. And then the one to watch really in the context of this audience is the Commonwealth. They have a business case for legal reform coming through around the November period. That's going to be a game changer because it's going to have a really interesting mix of all economies, island economies, big G7 economies, and everyone else in between. So it's going to really sort of make the case in a much more holistic way, and that's going to make life a lot easier. And then from an industry point of view, we've got to really focus on that pillar 3. You know, we know SMEs are struggling. We know this means some investment. We've got to get that business case into companies to say, look, this is going to cost you X, but the benefit is going to be Y. So that's going to be, you know, a big task over the next 2 to 3 years to try and bring industry along, and importantly, capitalize on these benefits when government removes the legal barriers. Really, really important.
Thank you, Chris. That is very succinct and well delivered. Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Amrita. What role can the multilateral trading system play to ensure that the use of blockchain narrows and not widens the gender gap? And are there any downsides to using blockchain for women in trade?
Thanks, Noreen, for this question. Let me answer the second part of your question first. So zooming back into blockchain, we're talking about digital trade, and I think one thing that we all as panelists agree upon is that digital trade is good. It has several opportunities, but we need to make it work for everyone, because if you don't make it work, if you don't put in the efforts, right regulation, then it can widen the existing gender gap. So blockchain can have many benefits, but it's certainly not a magic wand. This operator system cannot change laws and customs. It cannot reconstruct the societal setup and beliefs. Moreover, customer adoption is a huge challenge because first, users may not have the required infrastructure, such as internet and smart devices, and two, users may not know how to use them. A blockchain-based mobile application to receive or send money, for instance. And then the need to adapt to digital technology amidst the pandemic has increased this cost. With less funds, small businesses have problems covering these rising trade costs as they're required to invest more in various pandemic-induced procedures, inspections, revised certification procedures, standards compliance, cost of COVID testing, vaccinations for employees, in addition to investing in specialized IT systems and applications. So this shows how COVID-19 has made doing business and business models even more complex, and that digitalization is yet another challenge that women entrepreneurs and employees would need to harness, right? So just like free trade, unregulated digital trade can create more barriers for women as as it can further widen the existing divide. So what do we need? How do we make it work? I would say two things should be pretty high on the agenda. First, Susan has covered this point really well, increasing women's access to digital learning and technology. And second, having robust regulations that are coherent and relevant. Lack of regulation or prohibitive regulation is a serious detriment. And as Chris rightly pointed out, the laws do not recognize, and there are many domestic legal systems as we speak that do not recognize digital kind of transactions and documents created and used and saved, which are generated by blockchain's distributed ledger. Blockchain is still being regulated differently in different parts of the world. So the problem here is that domestic regulation to regulate digital trade may not work. As use of blockchain, for instance, for trade transactions especially, may cross various borders. What is required is a multilateral regulatory framework for regulatory coherence. And this is where multilateral organizations as WTO can play a vital role in, and I've explained the kind of role that WTO can play. I've made some proposals in the chapter in the WTO chair's publication. Having said that, I'm not sure if the time is ripe for a multilaterally negotiated regulation as of yet. This field is rapidly evolving. New applications, new businesses, new ways of doing trade are coming into the forefront. It's all changing in different parts of the world. So at this early stage, I believe that multilateral organizations can provide a forum for discussion, and they can develop a set of guidelines for the use of blockchain in international trade. And they can create a set of guidelines and send them to the national regulatory authorities and policymakers on how they can create a business conducive regulatory environment for these innovative technologies to flourish.
Thank you very much, Amrita. We are now going to actually open the floor for the Q&A, and there are some questions which have already been coming in. We will need to be brief because obviously we're going to try and answer as much as possible. And I've actually chosen a question for each of our speakers, which I will ask you to be as concise as possible in your answers, please. And the first one will go to Dr. Didakis. UNCTAD has been supporting countries on all continents with its Asikuda program. Some countries, such as St. Kitts and Nevis, have adopted 100% paperless trade processes, allowing for the continuity of businesses during the pandemic. How can this be amplified to increase the adoption of enabling private sector digital platforms, particularly financial services, which are needed to strengthen the region's economy, and digital trade services that require real-time payment? I will ask you to answer in a minute or two, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, it comes back to what we've been talking about, the need for us taking an ecosystemic approach. We're very grateful for the work that UNCTAD has done, and some spectacular benefits have obtained in the countries where it's been rolled out. But as valuable as Asikuda has been as a tool for paperless transactions, it's equally valuable as a source of data on commerce in the OECS that can drive trade policy decisions. our ambition in the OECS is to push for the adoption and utilization across the entire integration footprint to support the free movement of goods in our economic union and to enhance the ease of doing business through the modernization of customs. However, as Chris has pointed out, he's made a case for digitization of the entire trade process, and Asecuda, the customs process, is only one leg of that. I want to end by just giving you an analogy. Think of this as running a long bureaucratic relay race in which only one leg is being run with great speed and efficiency, but all the other legs are hamstrung with hurdles that do not optimize the opportunities. And that is the urgency to which Chris is speaking. And I certainly would want to post this webinar to be in touch with Chris to see how we can work together to close the loop and the circle in the OECS on that matter. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That is fantastic news. We can see our outcomes already developing here. Our next question is for Susan, which has come through. How can we collaborate with each other to best achieve these collaborative goals? What do you think is best practice with respect to exchange of information on approaches to data collection, analysis, monitoring of trade, and gender equality? And once I guess I will stress brevity, please.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think we acknowledge that data collection on digital trade and on women's participation can be difficult, since there are challenges to both collecting digital trade data and collecting gender data. So if you overlay those two on top of each other, you have a number of challenges. We need both quantitative and qualitative information. We need to cooperate with partners to share methods and procedures for developing data sets and conducting gender-focused analysis in relation to digital trade policies, including developing methods for monitoring women's participation in digital trade. In terms of quantitative data, we need to work with international organisations such as the OECD, who are doing great work on gathering gender-focused trade. And the UK are also onboarding onto SheTrade's Outlook to build that tool as a vehicle for to inform policy making and best practice. With respect to qualitative data, we should all aim to ensure that our policy making is informed by real women participating in international trade, either as business owners or employees in export-oriented firms. However, we must recognise the constraints that businesses face with respect to engaging with governments. Despite 81% of businesses stating that it's more important than ever to have an international trade strategy, 44% don't have the skills to engage with government stakeholders on trade issues, a core element of any trade strategy. So if larger businesses are identifying this challenge, then how much harder for small women-owned enterprises to engage? We must engage with groups that represent the needs of women as consumers and carers as well, to ensure that the wider benefits of international trade, such as lower consumer prices, are shared equally across society. And in particular, and finally, I want to signpost MC12 as a forthcoming opportunity to progress this agenda.
Thank you very much, Susan. And yes, we know MC12 is very, very important in everybody's calendars. Chris, the next question comes directed towards you. How will the new systems proposed for digital trade finance seek to respond to the needs of women traders for innovative technologies like mobile phone-enabled solutions, which can expand their access to basic financial services, enabling them to readily convert currency and store and transact money in digital form without the need of a bank account?
Well, I think one of the beauties of this kind of space is that if we tackle the problem that's in front of us, we automatically address the problem that we're talking about today, which is getting more women into trade. I mean, taking aside the points that Susan's quite rightly pointed out around data, these inequalities that are within the trading system. But overall, we know that if we go digital, more women can access systems and processes. We know women are using this kind of technology in some cases more than men. So we know the opportunity is there, but we don't need to separate out the activities that we do, this for women, this for men, this for other parts of the system. It's back to that ecosystem point. Let's get the building blocks in first and understand well what's required to do that. Drive that forward, because everybody wins. And at the end of the day, you know, we've got to make trade work for everyone here, wherever you're from in the world, and make sure nobody gets left behind. So that's why it's so imperative we get it right. Certainly from all the discussions that I'm part of, I think there is different understandings of what's required, and in some cases, not a deep enough understanding of how industry works. But we know what needs to be done. We know how to do it. We know how long it takes. We've got to provide more tools and assistance for emerging economies. That's absolutely for sure. But there is help on the way too. So, we know it needs to be done, but we've got to work together. We've got to stay focused. And if we do that, we can make an enormous amount of ground. I'm convinced 2021, we'll look back at 2021 as the breakthrough year. We've made more progress in the last 12 to 24 months than we've made in the last 20 to 30 years, just to put that in perspective. Now, COVID's played a part in that for sure, but I think what's happening is that this understanding that this direction of travel is happening is now starting to get real traction. So it's a huge opportunity for us to really accelerate the process of transformation so that everybody can take part, everybody can benefit, and it's a level playing field, and we don't get sort of widening inequalities, we get the opposite, closing inequalities.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to move with our last question that we can take because of time. Rita, this is directed at you. We understand that you have studied trade agreements to assess their gender component in the past. In your opinion, do existing trade policies include commitments on enhancing women's access to technology? May I ask you to please respond in a minute or so? Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Noreen. So yes, the answer is yes. Countries in their trade agreements have included commitments on increasing women's access to technology and internet. Two examples that come to my mind are CPTPP and Peru, Australia. Both trade agreements contain ambitious provisions in this respect. And it is very interesting to see that some of these same countries have also designed capacity building programs at the domestic level for women entrepreneurs. Australia, for instance, has developed an online training course with modules on export readiness, legal requirements, export opportunities, and e-commerce for women businesses in the APEC region. They reported it in their trade policy review reports, a report 2 or 3 years ago. So of course, there are challenges, but again, there are solutions too. And the good news is that we can find these solutions in the existing trade policies, in the existing framework. But we need to make them work. We need to put them into action. And the only way we can put them into action is by giving some thought to how these good-looking gender provisions sitting comfortably in trade agreements can be financed, implemented, and enforced.
Thank you very much, Amrita. And on that, I'm afraid we have to round up. All your Q&As, we will be collating them and we'll take note of them to actually take forward in our progress. At this point, I am going to pass over to my colleague to provide a recap of our discussion today. Before I do, I would like to take the opportunity to thank all our speakers and the team for all the thoughts you have shared with us. Dr. Roslyn Wanjiru, Global Lead on Trade and Investment Policy within WAY, I now pass over the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noreen, and thank you to all our speakers. It's been a very fruitful session, and I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. I'll be challenged to capture every point, but it's clear that the session has outlined how the rapid adoption of technologies is presenting us with good opportunities to help women participate in international trade. All the speakers here outlined that the low proportion of trade transactions which are completed electronically is a challenge, and they came up with a number of suggestions. Chris has really emphasized the potential for enhancing digital trade efficiencies and in a coordinated way, and has reported to us the work that the International Chamber of Commerce are doing to coordinate resources. And he did emphasize two things here. We need to reform our systems to support digital processes, and he highlighted the priority that we need to establish digital standards that are acceptable within the digital trade ecosystem. Now, Dr. Amrita Barry gave us some really expert insights into the role of technology and some of the challenges that are faced in terms of accessing finance and supporting SMEs and women businesses. She has some really good insights into how we can use trade agreements as a tool to support empowerment. And she spoke around the gender components within trade agreements, and her work is informing what the WTO is currently doing, as her book that she launched during this week sets out. Now, Susan's insights on the panel give us an overall overview of what the challenge is. She outlines the work that the UK government is doing around digital inclusion, as well as using trade policy as a tool to help scale us up. And she's given us some insights regarding how governments can actively support bilateral and multilateral policymaking towards digital trade and supporting of women. Dr. Jules gave us some very specific, very contextualized insights around how successful digital innovations have been pioneered in the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union. And he spoke around how to develop resilience within these payment systems. What I found really interesting about his insights is that he gave us some of the components that are needed to facilitate a coordinated, regional, multilateral response to address the digital divide. So overall, when we look at the panel, the key themes that are coming through are about digital technologies, digital currencies, and how these are emerging as opportunities to support digital ecosystems. So we've been told of the need to support and facilitate digital trade transactions and enhance efficiencies. All our panelists here have called for the need to consult and to agree shared priorities at the industry level, at the country level, regional level, and multilateral levels. And it's really interesting how that's come through. And a critical point that has come through from this session is the need to build up a robust evidence base. So I would like to thank our speakers, Susan Barton, Dr. Jules, Dr. Barry, and Mr. Southwood, Chris Southwood, for giving us their insights on these difficult questions. I would also like to thank our moderator, Noreen Cesario, who has moderated the panel really well, and our co-organizer, who is Nicole Patterson, the OIT Vice President. And from myself and colleagues at the WAY, which is a Women's Economic Imperative, we would really like to thank the audience and everybody for participating in this session. Thank you, everyone.